Hello and welcome back to StreamView.com. In this lecture, we're going to learn about exception handling. So before we try to learn about what exception handling is, we need to understand what exception is. So basically, exception occurs during the execution of the program due to bug in code or system failure. So what that basically means is, let's say you write, your Java code or your Ruby code, right, for your program, and for some reason your program crashed, right? So it could be a multiple issues. It could be because you had bug or you wrote some incorrect code which basically brought down the program, right? Or the environment, like where you were actually hosting it could be down, right? So there, in that case, the exception occurs, right? And your system would not work anymore, right? So how would you actually resolve the situation then? Well, basically, you can resolve the situation using exception handling, right? So exception in Java are normally of two types. The first one is checked exceptions. Checked exception occurs at the compile time. They are also called as compile time exceptions. These exceptions cannot simply be ignored at the time of compilation, which means the programmer should take care or handle these exceptions. For instance, reading file that does not exist. So let's say, for instance, you've written your code for your program, and that basically, checks if the file exists, right? Let's say you go to the website where you actually upload your file, right? And you try to upload the file, and let's say they did not provide any file, right? And they just click upload, right? In that case, they have not provided the file yet, right? And your program could crash because there's no file path in there, right? In that situation, you might need to handle those exceptions, right? That's why it's called checked exception. And in that case, you actually have to write some code that actually throws to the error that, hey, you need to actually provide the path of the file that you're actually trying to upload, right? So you're actually, if the user, if the user does not put the path, file path, or it puts invalid path, you should actually tell the user to provide the valid path or the path of the file that they're uploading. That's also called checked exception. The other one is unchecked exception. So unchecked exception is an exception that occurs at the time of execution. These are called runtime exception. These include programming bugs such as logic errors or improper use of an API. Runtime exceptions are ignored at the time of compilation. Example, reading the sixth element in 5-element array. So basically, right, you wrote a program and everything looks good, right? And you run it, and what happened was you're actually reading the sixth element in the 5th-element array. So let's say somebody created an array with 5 elements, right? And you cannot add in that element anymore. Then you try to add the element because you did not know that you cannot add in that array. And you try to add it and you try to read it and you threw an error, right? It did not work as expected because you're actually trying to read the 6th element, which is not stored in the 5th element. So in that case, you would want to throw an error to the user saying, or the programmer saying, hey, you cannot add element in the 5th element array. So that is called unchecked exception. And these unchecked exceptions are very hard to troubleshoot because they don't fail during compilation, right? When you run your Java program, it kind of compiles and try to see if there is any syntax error, right? This unchecked exception are kind of like a logic or programming bug, so you would not really see any compilation error, right? It's kind of very hard to troubleshoot. So now, exception handling in Java, right? So now we're going to learn about exception handling. So let's try to see how we can do that in Java, right? So exception handling in Java is done with try-catch block, where the exception are caught in the catch block. So what that basically means is, let's say I got this simple program here, exception handling, get static void main class, which we learn how to create one, right? And I have this string array, string names, new string 5. So as you can see, I've got this try class block, and here I'm actually trying to access the 5th element in the 5th index element in the 5th element array, right? So now if I try to do that, so as you can see, the array, if you have 5 elements, then the index starts with 0, right? So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 5 element. And here, what I'm trying to do is I'm actually trying to access the 5th element, which is not present in this array, names array, right? In that case, it's gonna throw an error. The way I catch it is using this catch block in here. It says array index out of bounds exception E, and it's gonna print the exception. So here, as you can see, I've got this array index out of bounds exception, right? So array index out of bounds exception is one of the exception types, right? Which basically says that, okay, you're trying to access the element that is outside the array. So here I've got this 5 elements and I'm trying to access the fifth index position, which is the sixth element, and it's not there, so it's gonna throw an error. Run this program, it's actually gonna throw java.lang.array index out of bound exception 6. So you're trying to access sixth element, which is not present in the fifth element array. So here, as you can see, I did caught the exception using this try and catch, right? And now here it's printing the error that I want here. It says exception is java.lang.array index out of bounds exception. So I use this try block to have my code that I wanted to run, and in case something happens, I want to run this one. So you use try and catch, okay? And in the catch and the parentheses, you provide the exceptions you want, right? Or normally you can just put exception as well. That's a general exception, and you provide the variable for the exception, and you can print out the exception message. So that is the one example of exception handling. The other one is also, you can also declare exception on method instead of using try catch block. So before, right, we use catch block in there. So instead of that, you can also do use throws, and you provide the exception type. So here I've got this throws keyword, and you do array index out of bounds exception, because I know that this is gonna throw an error if I try to access the fifth index position, right? So instead of doing try catch, you can also do this, right? That's a shortcut. Okay, and it's the same thing here, and it's going to say the same here, array index out of bounds exception. You can also execute your code statement with finally block along with try catch block. Finally block allows to execute irrespective of the occurrence of an exception. So let's say basically that you have a try and catch block, right? You want to do something, something happens, you do this, and finally you do something after that, right? So you can do that as well in Java, okay? And this is how you do it. So I've got this names array in here again, and I'm trying to access this fifth index position, and I will throw an error saying exception is. So instead of actually shutting down the program, I also want to do something else as well. So here, basically after this, right, you would want to execute this code. So basically here executes the code despite exception. So here, as you're trying to see here, I'm actually trying to index fifth index position, and that does not present, so it throws an error. Then here, I'm actually adding one more, okay, and Astley, and when I actually run this, it's going to say Astley. So now that is how you can use try catch and finally block. Finally block codes basically use finally this block in here. It's to execute the code despite the exception. So in here, we're going to create a new Java class, okay, and I'm going to name it exception handling 1. Okay, just click OK in here, and we're going to create a public static void main string args. First thing we're actually going to do is we're going to create an array here, call it names array, and in here we're going to create an array with, let's say, 5 elements. So now we got this names array, right? So before I do try catch block, I'm actually going to access the fifth element, index element. So I'm actually going to do element at fifth index is, so in here I'm actually going to do names 5, close that, and now let's try to run it first. And if I run this, and you can see here it says exception in thread java lang that index out of bound exception. So this is actually exception thrown by your system, right, by Java. Okay, so it's an exception in thread main. Okay, so here it's actually throwing an exception. The Java actually throws an exception for you, right? Now your case is here. Let's say I actually wanted to throw my exception instead of this Java exception. How would you do that, right? So we're going to do try catch. So I'm actually going to do try catch. So try in here, and I'm actually going to copy this and paste it there. So I'm actually going to delete this one, and here I'm actually going to do system.out.println, and here I'm actually going to do exception is, and in here I'm going to provide the E in here. So when I run it, as you can see here, it provided my exception, right? It says exception is and the Java lang.array index out of bounds exception. So now, right, so here exception is like a generic class, right? So it's gonna, like whatever exception you have, it's gonna throw that, right? Let's say you wanted to actually only throw this exception if it is array index out of bounds exception, right? If it is others, then I don't want to throw this exception, right? So in that case, you'd actually, so as you can see, right, when I do exception, it says array index out of bound exception. So I'm just going to copy this here and just paste it here, okay, and run this. Okay, and it says exception is Java lang array index out of bounds exception, right? So, all right, so that's how you can actually do try catch, right? So now the other thing we learned about is how you can actually, instead of using try catch, how you can actually use this shortcut, right? So basically, I'm actually gonna copy this file in here and paste it, and I'm actually going to name it exception handling 2. Click OK in there. So instead of using the try catch block, okay, I'm actually going to comment this. I can also do here, okay, your method where you have this try, where you want it to use the exception handling. You're going to use whatever method here. So my method here is main, right? So I'm going to do throws, and I'm actually going to do exception first. And in here, I'm actually going to copy this code again and paste it there. Okay, and let's just run this code in here, right? So here I'm actually saying throws exception. Okay, so if I run this, it's going to throw exception and throw it Java lang array index out of bounds exception. All right, so as you can see here, right, I ran this same code. Here I provided throws exception and ran the same code here, and it says the exception is array. So now instead of exception, I'm actually going to do array out of index out of bounds exception. So with this one, right, so it's going to catch the array index out of bounds exception. But with this code here, you're not going to actually get your code, but it's going to actually see if you have this error, array index out of bounds exception. So that's the other way you can actually do exception handling Java. Instead of using try catch, you can actually do array index out of bounds exception. Okay, and the final one here, I'm actually going to copy this and create a new file, and I'm actually going to copy this exception handling and paste it there. And in here, I'm actually going to do exception handling 3. All right, so now as you can see here, I've got this try catch block, right? So now what I'm actually going to do is finally, right? So here, finally, you can execute the other code. Okay, so now here, as you can see here, I've got this try and catch. So here, I'm actually going to do names. I'm actually going to provide here, I'm actually going to do name 4. Okay, equals, let's say, Danny. Okay, so here I'm actually going to do system.out.println. I'm actually going to say names. Let's take out the 5th one. Sorry, actually 4th one. And if I run this, right, let's run this code here, and you can see here, right, so first it gave me this exception here. Exception is Java lang array index out of bounds exception. So it's this program did not stop, right? It continued after this final block in here. So here I names 4. So I actually 4th index, I'm saying this name string is Danny. So I'm actually trying to print that string here, and it did here Danny. So I was able to run this line of code, okay, after this catch block. So I cut the exception, right? Array index out of bound exception. So instead of the computer throwing the error, I'm saying, okay, I got this exception is equal this, okay. I did not tell Java to stop executing the program, right? I tell, okay, you can go ahead and run this code in here. So that's how you can actually do try catch and finally block in here, right? So this one is normally done, this try catch finally is normally done in Java program when you're actually trying to read the file or write the file or access the file, right? So at first you try to open the file, right? And if there's no file, you can actually catch, you're going to provide that statement in here to say, hey, the file does not exist. And after that, you can actually, finally, let's say if there's no file exist, you can actually create a file, right, and write it. So this try catch finally is very, very important, if you're going to work as a Java programmer in real time, because you're going to be working on this try catch final block a lot. With that, you can actually handle exceptions easily. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you guys understood what exception handling is and how you can use try catch and finally block in Java to actually handle the exceptions. That's it for this lecture, guys. I will see you guys in our next lecture.